Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to dig into a decade that most people would rather just forget about?
Yeah, the 2000s, not exactly known for being a great time for investors.
Right, like dubbed the lost decade and all. But was it really all that bad? We're about to find out. We've got these articles, one from True Shares, another from Strathmore Capital Advisors, and let's see, oh yeah, one from AMG Wealth too.
And get this, they actually paint a surprisingly interesting picture of what went down. Like there's more to the story than just stocks went down.
Oh, I'm intrigued already. So where do we even start with this? It's not like the 2000s just appeared out of thin air.
You're telling me to understand the 2000s, you kind of have to rewind back to the late 90s, think dot-com boom, that whole crazy time.
The dot-com bubble. Good times. Or were they? But seriously, why are we going back that far?
Well, for one thing, the NASDAQ, which is like super heavy on tech stocks, it grew like 5 times bigger from 95 to 2000, fivefold. Crazy, right? But so much of it was all built on, I don't know, hype, hope, not exactly solid foundations.
Yeah. Wasn't that the era of everyone and their grandma trying to become a day trader?
Pretty much. But that's my point. Everyone was chasing those quick returns, but no one was really looking at the bigger picture. And when the bubble burst, well,
It burst bad.
77% drop for the NASDAQ in the early 2000s wiped out trillions, just gone poof.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah, and that's not even factoring in things like 9/11 happening right in there, too. Talk about economic uncertainty.
Right. Talk about a recipe for investors to be like, nope, I'm out of here.
Exactly. So we're talking about a time when everyone's still reeling from the dot-com crash, and then bam, the 2000s kick off, and it's not looking so hot.
Not so hot is an understatement.
Yeah.
I mean, the S&P 500, which is supposed to be like a good indicator of the overall U.S. market, it actually finished the decade down. Not exactly a glowing review for the stock market, you know.
If you're just looking at the price of the S&P 500, you're right. It does look like a bit of a dumpster fire. In fact, Strathmore Capital Advisors, they actually say that a dollar invested in the S&P 500 in 2000 would only have gotten you back like 90 cents by the end of '09.
Oof. So it really was a lost decade then. Case closed.
Well, not so fast. See, AMG Wealth, they point out that this whole negative return thing, it's only happened one other time in history, and it was during the Great Depression.
Okay. Now that puts things into perspective.
Right. Makes you wonder what else we might be missing, doesn't it?
Okay, now you've got me hooked. What else was going on that we might be overlooking?
Well, it turns out dividends that those payments companies make to shareholders, they actually made a huge comeback in the 2000s.
Really? Dividends? I mean, I know they exist, but I wouldn't have thought they'd be enough to, like, offset any major losses.
Yeah, see, after the whole dot-com crash, investors were kind of over the whole risky high growth thing. They wanted something more, stable, something they could actually rely on.
Makes sense. So are you saying companies were like, hey, let's just give people their money back?
Kinda. Companies started focusing more on like rewarding their shareholders with cold, hard cash. Those dividend payouts, they went way up.
Yeah, I'm listening. But how does that change the whole lost decade thing?
Well, True Shares, they pointed out that while, yeah, the S&P 500 prices were down for the decade overall, when you factored in those juicy dividends, the total return wasn't actually negative anymore.
Wait, hold up. You're saying dividends alone wiped out those losses from the stock prices?
You got it. Dividends actually contributed every single percentage point of the total return for the S&P 500 in the 2000s. It's wild. Complete opposite of what was happening in the 90s when dividends were like a tiny sliver of the total return.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing. So if you were just watching the S&P 500 price, you'd think, oh man, my investments are tanking. But behind the scenes, those dividends were actually keeping things afloat.
Exactly. And it highlights something that Strathmore Capital Advisors talks about: diversification.
Right, diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Got it.
Well, yeah, that's the basic idea. But they take it a step further. Think about it. Even if that basket is the entire U.S. stock market, it's still just one basket, right?
True. And if the U.S. market takes a hit, well, there goes your breakfast.
Exactly. See, different international markets, they don't always move in the same direction. So while the U.S. might be having a lost decade, other parts of the world could be, throwing a party.
Oh, interesting. So having a globally diversified portfolio could have potentially softened the blow a bit, kind of balance things out.
Exactly. And AMG Wealth actually takes this idea of diversification and applies it within the U.S. market itself.
Wait, what? You can diversify within a single country? How does that even work?
So they looked at the S&P 500, But instead of using like the traditional way of weighting it, which by the way, gives a lot of power to the biggest companies they used, an equal weighted approach.
Equal weighted. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one. It sounds a little technical for me.
And think of it like this. Every company in the S&P 500, no matter how big or small, gets an equal vote. It's like leveling the playing field for all the companies.
Okay, interesting. And what happened?
Yeah.
What'd they find? Okay, interesting. And what happened? What'd they find?
Turns out, with that equal weighted approach, you actually would have seen a positive return for the whole decade. So while the traditional S&P 500, the way most people think about it, yeah, that could have lost you money. But this different strategy, it actually could have grown your investments.
That's wild. So by giving those smaller companies more voting power, you're saying there's a chance you could have actually come out on top during the quote-unquote lost decade.
Exactly. It just goes to show, even within one single market, there are so many different ways to approach things. And those choices, they can make a huge difference in the end.
This is seriously making me rethink this whole lost decade thing. I mean, we started off thinking it was all doom and gloom, but now it sounds like, yeah, if you knew what to look for, there were actually some real opportunities for growth hidden in there.
You got it. I think the 2000s were like a crash course in, I don't know, not believing everything you hear. Don't just focus on the negative headlines. Think about those dividends. Remember how important diversification is. Even in a market that seems kind of, I don't know, bleak on the surface, there are always going to be those little pockets of opportunity. You just got to know where to look.
It's like, don't just react to whatever the market's doing right this second. You got to understand the bigger picture.
100%. If there's one thing the 2000s taught us, it's that just because something happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to happen again the same way. You got to stay informed, think for yourself, and yeah, maybe even question some of those assumptions everyone else seems to be taking for granted.
It definitely makes you think twice about calling any decade or any time period really lost, right?
Yeah.
So much of it is about how you look at it. So if there's one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today, what would it be?
That's a good one. I think for me, it's all about perspective. The 2000s, maybe they weren't a lost decade, but they were definitely a time when investors had to learn and adapt big time. But by understanding what went down those dividends, that need for diversification, hopefully investors can use that knowledge to be ready for whatever the market, throws at us next.
I love that. It's not about trying to predict the future. It's about giving yourself the tools and the knowledge to handle whatever comes your way. Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, a huge thank you to you for walking us through this deep dive into the 2000s. I know I learned a lot.
Anytime. Glad to be here.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Keep those brains engaged, keep asking those questions, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.